They promised a strategy to transform the lives of 14 million disabled people in Britain. But has the government failed its first major test of whether levelling up means anything? Good evening. In his intro to the National Disability Strategy, Boris Johnson admitted a disabled person with a degree has about as much chance of getting a job as a non-disabled 16-year-old school leaver. That deep unfairness requires government action. Yet disability campaigners say the strategy is a damp squib, a missed opportunity to make those slogans of building back better and levelling up actually mean something. Tonight, we hear the stories of people who have been suffering the same indignities for years on transport, education, jobs, and the disproportionate impact of poverty on the 1 in 5 of us who has a disability. And their anger at a document they say has been written for disabled people, not by them.
Also on tonight's programme, cleared for takeoff. From next month, double-jabbed people in the US and most of Europe will, like British holidaymakers, be able to avoid quarantine if they're flying from amber list countries. Dressaging for success. Charlotte Desjardins is Britain's greatest female Olympian as she wins her 6th Olympic medal. And as the Ministry of Justice announces criminals will be given accommodation to stop them reoffending when they leave jail, we speak to one charity which has been offering similar provision for decades but is now forced to close because of budget cuts.
If we don't start seeing them as human beings, then what's going to happen is they're going to continue to reoffend and create more victims and cause more harm to the public.
And later, is establishment groupthink threatening our chances of fighting climate change? As we get used to the daily deluge of extreme weather disasters, will the independent group of scientists called the Climate Crisis Advisory Group make us think bigger about what we could do to repair the planet and even refreeze the melting polar ice?
Looking at those technologies is really mainly looking at buying more time. So how can I buy the planet another 30 years of odd time in order to allow important, deep and rapid emission cuts?
Now, the government has unveiled its £1.6 billion national disability strategy to a rather muted response. Campaigners and charities have welcomed some of the measures, but say the whole thing is lacking in scope and ambition. Today's pledges include more accessible homes by raising planning requirements for new builds and adapting old ones, a survey of every mainline train station in the UK to determine how accessible they are, and £300 million to support children with special educational needs and disabilities. But all this comes after years of cuts to disability welfare. 650,000 disabled people have had their personal independence payments reduced or cut completely since 2013. And spending on disability welfare this year will be £5 billion less than when the Conservatives came to power in 2010. A 2019 report by the UN Human Rights Commission said the changes were driving some disabled people to breaking point. Our Home Affairs correspondent Darshana Soni reports.
Is that the chap who won the gold yesterday as well?
Yes. Simply going out for a walk can be a tricky thing to navigate for Nathan Giles and his carer. The 25-year-old is a sociology lecturer at a local college in Redditch.
What are some of the practical difficulties for you, Nathan, when you go out in your wheelchair?
I've been abandoned on trains before, was my carer, had to go and summon assistance. That's obviously not very practical for train timetabling because the train can't leave with me on it.
So that must have been really frustrating, being abandoned on that train.
Yes, it is, but we come to expect it.
Having to expect difficulties every single day. Mr. Giles lives with his mum Donna and sister Keris, who also has cerebral palsy. But it's not just the practicalities. Mrs. Giles says it's often attitudes that are a barrier.
Both of ours, we encourage to do volunteering, do different things, and just to help out within society, and just to get out and do whatever they want to do.
But you still feel that there are barriers to that, and people just assume that because they're wheelchair users?
Yeah, there can be that assumption that, oh, maybe they won't want to do that.
As the Giles family have found, transport is a huge headache. But of course, it's not the only barrier faced by those with disabilities every single day. The government's announced a list of 100 pledges to tackle issues such as housing, employment and education. It describes it as a once-in-a-generation transformative plan. But critics describe it as a mixture of a to-do list and a should-have-been-done-by-now list. Reaching some impressive speeds, Anna Wafula-Strike is a Paralympic wheelchair racer. She's critical of today's announcement because of the lack of consultation.
It is something about us, without us, if you know what I mean. Where is the action? How is this going to be implemented?
The athlete has campaigned for disability rights after a degrading experience on a train.
I'm just about to jump on my train and I'm a little bit nervous.
When she was forced to wet herself because the accessible toilet wasn't working.
When I had that horrible, humiliating experience on the train, I felt so disabled. I felt so alone, you know. It's and I think to me, I just needed a toilet that was accessible.
It should be a simple ask, say campaigners. The government is going to audit mainline railway stations for disabled accessibility. But the timing of today's strategy has been questioned because the consultation process is the subject of a judicial review.
Well, it's midnight. I've arrived back in Leeds, having booked assistance for this journey some weeks ago.
Doug Pawley made this video when he was left stranded on a train after midnight because there was no one to put a ramp down for him. He's one of those challenging the government over some of the assumptions behind today's strategy.
This is a survey directed at disabled people, and yet it asked us if we would be prepared to have an intimate relationship with a disabled person. And I'm thinking, first of all, what's that got to do with our experience as disabled people and how the government can impact on it? And secondly, what?
Ministers say they are consulting and listening, but today they faced another legal setback when a judge ruled that a lack of sign language at 2 government COVID briefings served to disempower, frustrate and marginalise.
Darsh Nassani reporting. Well, joining me now from Elgin is the Conservative peer, Lord Shinquin. How has this happened? How's it gone wrong?
Good evening, Krishnan, and first of all, can I thank Channel 4 News for leading on such an important issue. How has it gone wrong? I think Doug Pawley made a very pertinent point, and also Mrs. Giles. This is all about attitude. This is all about culture, particularly at the Department of Work and Pensions. If you look at the online survey that Doug Pawley has successfully persuaded the High Court should be subject to a legal challenge, it's so obviously written by non-disabled people. Likewise, the strategy, the moment I opened it, I knew that it was written by non-disabled people talking about the other, i.e. disabled people. And in the Department of Work and Pensions view, we are invalids, we are supplicants, we are recipients, we are not equals.
But, I mean, is that really the reason this would happen? I mean, most laws are drawn up by civil servants who are not from the group that they are drawing up a law about. You know, did you have to be disabled to draw up a strategy that would work? I mean, there was a big consultation. The government says 14,000 disabled people have contributed to this. Is that not true?
There are 14 million of us, Krishnan, so I think it's an infinitesimally small fraction of the number of us. And as Doug Pawley pointed out, it was a very offensive survey, drafted so obviously by non-disabled people. And what it showed was actually there isn't partnership. There was simply us as disabled people being told still what is good for us, and to like it or lump it. And the fact that we're being told we have been listened to when it's so clear we haven't been, tells me there's a real problem here.
Is this savable then? I mean, how can you turn this into something that does work for you?
Well, I think government, sadly, is making itself slightly irrelevant because actually business are already doing quite a few of the things that we're asking, particularly in the employment arena, such as disability employment and pay gap reporting, that government is saying, no, won't wash with business. So I think business is leading, and I'm hoping government will follow. But one of my concerns as a supporter of the Prime Minister, obviously as a Conservative, is what are the implications, as you said in your opening remarks, for the Prime Minister's levelling up agenda? Because it has failed its first big test in this strategy.
OK, so I mean, well, government has to be relevant and in this because it's not enough for businesses to work. As you say, if this is 14 million people, there's no way you can transform their lives without government intervention. So what is the next move?
I think the next move is the ball that's in the government's court. It needs to reflect on why this has landed so badly with disabled people and why, as Doug Paulley pointed out, there is now a legal challenge that's going to be heard to consider the level of engagement the government had with disabled people. So that's the first thing government needs to correct and address very urgently. But then it needs to work constructively with business to set a level playing field so it can compete for the best talent, for example, in employment, openly and consistently. And that means mandatory employment and pay gap reporting, for example. That's just one example. But I think the key issue here is the cynicism. I think the government needs to stop digging. The hole is already big enough.
Lord Shinkwin, thank you very much for joining us.
Now, this could salvage summer, say travel bosses, as the government announced that quarantine will be scrapped for fully vaccinated people from the United States and the EU if they arrive in England from an amber country. This evening, the Scottish government said it will do the same. The weekly trend of infections in the UK is still down, although just over 27,500 new COVID cases in the UK were reported today, a rise on yesterday, along with a further 91 deaths. Our political correspondent Liz Bates is in Westminster. Liz.
Yes, so first of all, this is a big sign of confidence from the government that the vaccine rollout in the UK and internationally is offering enough protection to really push ahead with opening up. Now, this latest relaxation of the rules will come into force on Monday at 4 a.m. France is still exempt at the moment, but the government has said that that is under review. And it will also include international cruises, which will be able to restart. And this has all come as a big boost, of course, to the travel industry, which has been very hard hit by COVID. There is still the question, though, of whether EU countries and the US will reciprocate. Will they relax their rules for people travelling from the UK? No sign yet that there's an agreement forthcoming on that. And that's something that the Transport Secretary was asked about earlier today.
I've just spoken to my US counterpart today, and in the US, they still have an executive order which prevents travel from the UK, from Europe, from several other countries to the US. So we're saying you can come here, you can come and visit, you can come and see friends, you can come as a tourist if you've been double vaccinated and follow the rules without quarantine. We can't change that on the other side, but we do expect that in time they'll release that executive order, which was actually signed by the previous president.
Another sign of confidence today came from the Prime Minister. He has said that on the 16th of August, people that are double jabbed will no longer have to self-isolate. Now, that was always part of the sort of COVID roadmap, but he has indicated today that that date is now nailed on. It will go ahead. One final announcement as well from the Foreign Secretary that the UK will join a huge international effort to send COVID vaccines all over the world to places that need them. The UK has been criticised on this, that it's been too slow to act, but we found out today that 9 million vaccines will be sent out this week to places like Kenya, Indonesia and Jamaica, and this is part of a much bigger goal for the UK to send 100 million vaccines all over the world by 2020.
Liz, thanks very much. Krish.
Now, more than 40 former military commanders are calling for urgent action to help Afghans who served alongside British forces to settle in the UK, warning that time is of the utmost essence in the face of a resurgent Taliban. The Ministry of Defence says they've already helped more than 2,200 former Afghan staff and their families to relocate to the UK. But today's joint letter warns that too many applications are being rejected, putting at risk the very people who helped to save countless British lives. Fatma Manji reports.
If any of our former interpreters are murdered by the Taliban, the dishonour would lay squarely at our nation's feet. That's the view of some of the most senior former British Army officials, who are urging the government to act immediately. An open letter expressing grave concerns has been signed by more than 40 veterans, including some of those who headed the British Armed Forces.
The threat to them is real. The Taliban are not discriminating between the nuances of employment, whether someone was terminated or subcontracted, or if they were a chef instead of an interpreter. The Taliban are very clear that if anyone worked for the British or indeed the international forces, that they will be attacked.
Around 2,200 Afghans and their families have left the country to relocate to the UK. In May, the British government announced an accelerated policy for relocation amid fears for the safety of former interpreters. But some Afghans who worked for Britain can't apply because they were subcontracted, while others have already been rejected. Around 100 of them joined a protest outside the British Embassy in Kabul, calling on the UK government to stop ignoring them. Like Sharif Karimi, who asked us not to show his face.
Taliban are falling cities very quickly. We all, interpreters, are in high risk. If the UK government does not relocate us to UK, we will be killed by Taliban. I hide myself at home for many weeks. I cannot go outside to bazaar for shopping due to my work with the British forces. I change my location in every 3 or 2 months because the Taliban, they have very strong intelligence.
The policy doesn't allow Afghan staff who were dismissed from service to apply. Campaigners say that's unfair because it's around 35% of all the interpreters, many of whom were dismissed for minor reasons.
They were terminated because they spent an extra day on leave, or they answered back to a non-commissioned officer who wanted them to take out the latrines. These are not heinous crimes.
The Ministry of Defence declined to be interviewed. In a statement, they told us the government is the only nation with a permanent expert team in Kabul to investigate claims from courageous local staff.
Fatima Manji reporting there. Now, it's helped house some of the most serious offenders in England for more than 40 years, providing a bridge between life in jail and life on the outside. But on Friday, the project run by the charity Change, Grow, Live will close for good. Once funded by the local authority, cuts to their budget mean they can't afford it anymore. 2/3 of the offenders who've lived in the special supported accommodation stay out of jail. But now it's being closed down, it's feared that more men could end up back on the streets and straight back to a life of crime. Our social affairs editor, Jackie Long, reports.
At first, I couldn't go into a shop, not in a big shop, it's a supermarket, because everything was like zooming down on me. You do probably have a few sleepless nights and that, because you're used to a prison cell, then you've got a bed, a proper bed to sleep in and that,
Released a year ago after spending 20 of the last 30 years in prison, Joe, not his real name, is a man who's learnt not to look vulnerable. He says he needed time to learn to live on the outside again, but he's being forced to move out of his room at the end of the week.
So where are you left now once this place is closed?
Well, at the moment, I'll choose my words here and that, in a very dark place, let's put it that way.
He's been staying in a house run by a charity which takes in the most serious offenders. Joe in some ways is lucky. He has some savings, but so far has been unable to find anywhere else to live. Private landlords rarely rent to ex-prisoners, let alone ex-prisoners on universal credit.
For other prisoners that you know who do come out and are sort of, they have to face the world again by themselves, essentially, how difficult do you think it is not to have somewhere like this?
Very, very difficult indeed. And lots of them do turn to crime again. They'll be a menace to the public and that. This is what will happen in that. Yeah.
Around 2,000 former prisoners have passed through the project run by the charity Change, Grow, Live in the 42 years since it's been set up. CGL provides a bridge between life on the inside and life outside for some of the most serious long-term offenders in the country. But the project is closing on Friday. At its most basic, the ultimate aim is to stop prison leavers reoffending. But those who've lived here say it does much more. This man, we've changed his voice to protect his identity, moved out last month.
Do you think it saved your life?
Oh yes, I'll be honest, I've had suicide attempts in my life before. They need these special units for certain prisoners, and if you put a mental health person in a hostel where there are 25 or 28 druggies or alcoholics or violent people, they're going to struggle. If I was coming out of prison now, I would fear for my life.
2/3 of the men who come through the project go on to live independently. A third are recalled to prison, often a result of staff monitoring their behaviour.
Do we know where he is, where he's gone?
Yeah, back to custody.
It's been funded by West Sussex County Council since 2003, but budget cuts meant they could no longer afford to continue. And for the last 4 months, CGL has funded the project itself. It will be replaced by a patchwork of different services, including offering prison leavers 84 nights accommodation before they have to find their own place.
I think it's a quick fix. I think it looks great on paper, but I think the long-term impact will be a lot of people presenting as street homeless or going back to custody.
You are trying to prevent them, obviously, from reoffending, but at the same time being acutely aware that it's a possibility.
So we're kind of constantly checking their behaviour, we're constantly having reviews, we're constantly feeding information to probation and the police. There is also an element of monitoring, so we will be doing room searches, watching CCTV. So there's a staff presence in each house, so just by nature of us being here, we pick up on the sort of subtle changes in someone's behaviour that might indicate an increase in risk.
What do you fear will happen to some of the people who will come out of prison and not have a facility like this?
I just think they'll flounder and they'll really struggle. You know, I know that we've helped hundreds, if not thousands of men.
These are people who have carried out very serious crimes. The public are not always sympathetic to them. Why do you think it's important that services like this exist for them?
There's no getting away from the fact that the service users we support have committed really serious offences that will have lifelong impacts to the victims and their families. But if we don't start seeing them as human beings and wanting them to have a good offence-free life and supporting them to do that, then what's going to happen is they're going to continue to reoffend and create more victims and cause more harm to the public.
A year in CGL is £18,344. A year in prison is £44,000. Today, the Ministry of Justice said basic temporary accommodation will be provided to keep prison leavers off the streets to stop reoffending. They say 140 councils will be given a share of £13 million to help get ex-offenders into longer-term housing, and that they have invested £200 million in rehabilitation services and recruited 2,500 extra probation officers. But staff here say prison leavers will no longer get the same level of scrutiny and that the public may still be at risk. Joe may now have a sense of freedom, but he still doesn't have a permanent place to live, and nor do several other men currently being housed by CGL. The future is even less certain for men leaving prison over the coming weeks and months.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Prisons and Probation Minister, Alex Chalk, and I began by asking him if he regretted the closing of the Change, Grow, Live project.
Well, I think the work that's been done with Change, Grow, Live is something that we want to build on. And indeed, we are in very, very dramatic fashion. So Change, Grow, Live help at any one time between 30 and 40. That's really important. We are going to be helping over 3,000 prison leavers a year and making sure they don't go into homelessness. Because with this £20 million, we will guarantee 12 weeks of accommodation. Now, that period provides the stability so that that offender can get the chance to address all the other myriad aspects in their life that need fixing. But what you really need as well is the staff to really work with that offender and put them on a straight track. And that's why we're recruiting a record number of probation officers. It'll be 1,000 last year. We recruited 1,000 last year, average about 600. And it'll be 1,500 next year. So very significant uplift in the amount of recruitment.
With all those extra probation officers, though, does that restore the numbers cut since 2010 or not?
No, this is a dramatic increase in our investment in probation. So we're putting in around £300 million because we know if you can bring the workload down of individual probation officers, you give them more bandwidth, if you like, to actually provide that really detailed management of those individuals. Working together with those, we've done a homelessness prevention task force, which are probation officers working in custody with those offenders as well, so that they get support in custody, they get support when they come out of custody into this 12-week accommodation.
So 16,000 probation officers once you've hired these extra ones, but how many were there in 2010?
Well, look, I don't know. I wasn't in Parliament in 2010, but what I can tell you is this, is that the initiative that we're providing now is genuinely groundbreaking. It wasn't going on in 2010. It wasn't going on in 2005. And this is a step change.
The Ministry of Justice has seen spending cut by 25% since 2010. And you're telling me you don't know whether the probation officers are whether there's more or fewer probation officers now than in 2010. I just wonder why you hadn't asked.
So it was the case, you're right, that after 2010 spending was reduced. That's absolutely correct. But over recent years, spending has increased really quite significantly. But going into local authorities as well. So it's not just, by the way, probation, but also local authorities themselves can team up with probation to assist individuals to turn their lives around.
Boris Johnson announced yesterday an expansion of electronic tagging for burglars. What evidence do you have that that is effective?
Well, look, the business about the electronic tagging is that this meant for those who are guilty of acquisitive offences, so you're right, burglars are one, but you could also be robbers or thieves as well, this is about, on the one hand, making sure that those individuals who come out of custody know that if they were minded to slip back into their old ways, and we hope that the support they're given means that they don't do that, but if they're minded to do that, that tag means that the police are likely to catch up with them. The point is, people will respond to incentives and people respond to boundaries, so to speak. So that if you are somebody who is emerging from custody and wants to turn their life around, this provides a daily reminder that when they might be tempted, for example, to mix in the wrong crowd or to get involved in the wrong activities, that this is something that may well lead to them being caught and sent back to custody. Now, I think that we should try to find the treasure in the heart of every man, as Winston Churchill put it. That also means ensuring that those individuals who are tempted to go the wrong way are actually brought back onto the right path. And that's exactly what these tags will do. And they'll do that as a matter, I'm bound to say, of basic common sense.
Alex Chalk, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, a woman who stole diamonds worth more than £4 million has been jailed for 5.5 years. Posing as a gem expert, Lulu Lakatos, who's 60 years old, swiped the diamonds from the luxury Mayfair jewellers' boodles by swapping them for a bunch of pebbles in her bag. She then tried to pin the crime on her younger sister, who had died in a car crash in 2019. The real diamonds have never been recovered. Well, if all the COVID restrictions are keeping the Taj Mahal, the Egyptian pyramids, or indeed any other wonders of the world out of reach this summer, you might consider heading to North Wales. Its Gwynedd slate quarries have now joined the ranks of those famous landmarks in becoming a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Part of a hospital in Greater Manchester caught fire after it was hit by lightning. The blaze broke out on the roof at Trafford General Hospital during a heavy thunderstorm just before 2:30 this afternoon. Firefighters spent 2 hours putting out the flames, while a small number of patients and staff had to be evacuated from wards and clinical areas.
Now, the flash floods, wildfires, lightning strikes and the extreme weather that swept much of the world over the last month is prompting fears that climate change is accelerating at a pace faster than ever anticipated. Concerns amplified in a report by some of the world's top climate experts, which has been shared with this programme. The Climate Crisis Advisory Group, set up by Sir David King, say that the warming of the Arctic contributes to record-breaking heat and rainfall we're seeing. But could scientists manage to reverse engineer the climate crisis and refreeze the ice caps? Scenes of disaster, all from just the last month. From North America to Germany to China, these are the extreme weather conditions that the science told us to expect. But in a paper shared exclusively with this programme, some of the world's top climate experts say the pace is faster than ever predicted and is being partly driven by what's happening many miles away on top of the world.
It's becoming more and more clear in the scientific community that what we have seen cannot just be up to 1.2 degrees of global warming. Much more, it has to be connected to the melting and the warming that we see in the Arctic.
It's called Arctic amplification. On current trajectories, it looks as if the Arctic will be summer ice free sometime in the next 10, 15, 20 years, maybe 5 years.
I believe what is happening is that the world weather systems are in transition now, and this transition at the moment is heavily driven by what's happening in the Arctic Circle region.
The Arctic is warming much faster than the rise in global average temperatures. Over the last 30 years, the Arctic has warmed at a rate of 0.81 degrees Celsius per decade, more than 3 times faster than the global average.
There are now already cities that we have to start saying will not be livable in just 30 years' time.
The newly formed Climate Crisis Advisory Group say ice melting will not just lead to sea level rise, but contribute to the record-breaking heat and rainfall in parts of the Northern Hemisphere. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic.
As the ice is melting in the Arctic Ocean is becoming fresher. And if that fresh water makes its way into the North Atlantic, it can disrupt the ocean circulations, which would again have a knock-on effect throughout the whole of the Northern Hemisphere.
But we also expose the permafrost, and this is permanently frozen ground underneath the Arctic ice, and this releases methane.
Those are hundreds to 300 times more potent than CO2 emissions. And once you cross that point, then really there is, a huge threat to civilization.
These lush forests in Finland are on the edge of the Arctic Circle. This spring, temperatures shot up from minus 30 degrees to plus 31, a 61-degree change in a matter of just 6 weeks. In the town of Selki, near the border with Russia, lives Tero Mustonen, a lead author for the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Forest fires have become the symbol all across the northern regions, including the boreal and now increasingly so into the tundra, of how extreme weather events are affecting the north.
The intensity and scale of heat here has never been seen before. A record was broken this spring of 27 days of temperature above 25 degrees.
We are starting to witness the fact that increased tundra fires and forest fires are causing the melt events on permafrost and further adding methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Even further north in Finnish Lapland, the indigenous Sami community is having their way of life disrupted by the warming of the habitat. Cold water dependent fish such as Arctic char, which are essential to food security for the Sami people, might be facing regional extinction.
Urgent actions are needed, especially Arctic char is really suffering these Celsius degrees, and we don't even know whether or not such species or types of Arctic char have already been extinct during these last couple of extremely warm summers.
With changes in this region risking catastrophe for all of us, Some now argue that cutting carbon emissions is no longer enough. Radical ideas like refreezing the Arctic are being considered in the report released tomorrow. One technology known as cloud brightening would involve pumping tiny droplets of seawater into the air. The low white clouds that form, full of tiny salt crystals, would reflect away the warming rays of the sun and stop the surface from getting too hot.
Looking at those technologies is really mainly looking at buying more time. So how can I buy the country and how can I buy the planet another 30 years of odd time in order to allow the implementation of important, deep and rapid emission cuts?
Of course, none of these technologies would stop the need to reduce emissions, and caution is urged by those near the communities where this type of technology, often called geoengineering, would be used.
The geoengineering question it's a human rights question, it's an ethical question. What will the indigenous peoples that will be impacted? This should be our utmost last effort. And before that, we should have exhausted all possible other means.
The question is, how much time do we have before all other possible means are exhausted? As weather events become more extreme and existential, the window to stop the warming of the Arctic, and indeed the planet, is closing. Well, joining us now from Cambridge is the chair of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, former Chief Scientific Advisor and then the UK Special Representative for Climate Change until 2017, Sir David King. Sir David, is refreezing the Arctic really possible, or is it a fairy tale at the moment? And if it's a fairy tale, isn't it quite irresponsible to put it out there?
Well, Krishnan, I don't believe it is a fairy tale, but let me just say, I don't know what the alternative is. We're saying we have to reduce emissions far more rapidly than we are today. We have to leave fossil fuels in the ground. We have to remove the excess greenhouse gases that we have already put into the atmosphere that are creating this crisis today and into the future. And then to buy time while we manage that process, or those two processes, we will also need to refreeze the Arctic. Now, I don't think it's ridiculous. We have at least half a dozen different processes that we're looking at, and we prefer to look at processes that mimic the natural world process. And what you've just seen there is the marine cloud brightening technique that we're working with, and Stephen Salter up in the University of Edinburgh is the marine engineer who's most advanced on this technology. I do believe it's doable, but I have to say to you that without this, what are we going to do? Because we simply don't have the time we need to reduce emissions. And at the moment, we're talking about mid-century. Let's hope we can do it much more quickly than that. And to bring greenhouse gas levels down to something like the pre-industrial level, that's going to take us to the end of the century. We need that critical time. Buying time becomes essential.
So are you and this new group of scientists that you're chairing saying effectively that the goals of COP26, which are still, they say, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, I mean, that we've missed that already? It's just not going to happen.
Right. So today, Krishnan, we're at 1.2 degrees or 1.25 degrees above the pre-industrial level. We're heading rapidly towards that 1.5. But even at 1.25, where we are today, we're saying it looks as if the Arctic Circle region has passed its tipping point. That means the ice will continue to be lost. And what we haven't discussed on this program yet is the consequences of that for sea level rise. As the ice on the sea melts, that's not going to cause additional sea level rise. But the ice on Greenland, which is now sitting in that blue Arctic Sea during the polar summer, that ice is being lost more and more rapidly over every 5 years that goes past. And as all the ice on Greenland melts, global sea levels will rise by enormous amounts. And what we're saying is, unless we actually step in and do these things, we're going to see sea levels rise such that countries like Vietnam will be 95% under seawater in just 30 years' time. So we're looking at potential disasters around the world, which will create a new class of climate migrants looking for somewhere else to live. And this, just in Southeast Asia, may amount to 200 million plus people looking for somewhere else to live.
And is your advisory group there because, rather as you did with Independent Sage on COVID, you feel that the official scientists aren't really telling it as it is?
No, that's not what I'm saying. We have set up a group that is agile. We will produce a report every month into the future, and we have public meetings every month. We're putting everything that we determine, and this report, as you've seen, Krishnan, is very detailed. We're putting every bit of information we gather into the public domain. These aren't just 15 experts. These are, I believe, 15 world-leading experts, many of them, for example, involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. So it's not as if we're criticizing them. We're simply giving an ability to do an agile response. And that's why what we're talking about now is the extreme weather events that are being experienced this summer, that are being experienced right now. The floods in Germany, as your report has just expanded on, are happening right now. And we're giving a causal explanation and then what needs to be done.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, there's been more success for Team GB at the Olympics as Charlotte Dujardin took bronze in the dressage event, becoming Britain's most decorated female Olympian. She described it as mind-blowing. Swimmer Tom Dean won his second gold as part of the men's freestyle relay team, while there was a silver medal for Britain's rowers. Kamian Zeram reports.
Few people can make a horse dance quite like Charlotte Dujardin. Riding with a new partner, Gio, they claimed the bronze in the individual dressage. Dujardin is now Team GB's most decorated female Olympian ever, with 3 golds, a silver and 2 bronzes. And she has every intention of adding to that tally with the Paris Games in 3 years' time. Team GB's outstanding start in Tokyo continued this morning with another gold in the pool in the men's 4x200 free. Tom Dean's second in as many days.
Pretty special. Double Olympic champion sounds pretty good, and the last 24 hours have been a bit crazy. Yeah, it was amazing seeing all your family and friends back home celebrating and kind of everyone coming together.
Win an Olympic medal and you become the property of the nation. But to Mum, perhaps even better than winning yourself.
I was just so buzzing and wired by 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock this morning that I had to leave it all behind for a minute and jump in the river. So at 5 o'clock this morning, I said, I'm going for a river swim. And a few other people at the party was like, that's a good idea. Should we go and jump in the Thames? So that's what I did.
It's the first time GB have won 3 swimming golds since London 1908, when they also won the tug of war, and the vault looked like this. Rowing has changed rather less over the years. A British silver in the men's quadruple sculls this morning, an achievement in itself, but also took some of the pain away from an agonising 4th place in the men's 4. GB were favourites, but a steering calamity sent them veering off course, narrowly avoiding a collision. The ups and downs of elite sport. Sometimes things just go wrong. And in the fishbowl of an Olympic Games, the pressure is so much more intense. One of the world's greatest ever athletes, Simone Biles, has now pulled out of the individual all-round competition, following her early exit from the team event. For a gymnast, risking mental health could have life-changing consequences.
When we land a tumble, 7 times our body weight's going through our ankles. Now, if you're not completely focused and your headspace is not completely right, 7 times your body weight going through the floor, going through your ankles, something really dangerous could happen. So 100%, I'm so proud of her for speaking up.
I really hope that it really helps athletes and encourages athletes to actually be more self-aware about their mental health. It also begs the question, how many athletes have competed and they haven't communicated this.
One more piece of almost medal news for Team GB today. Featherweight boxer Karis Artingstall is guaranteed at least a bronze after winning her semi-final. Tonight, GB sit 6th in the medals table.
Knockout report from Kami and Zeram.
After the break, now you see it, now you don't. Watching the best of the world's athletes is meant to inspire children to take up sport themselves. But what if this year's rights deal means most of the exciting action is stuck behind a paywall? Now, if you're trying to enjoy the best of Team GP's medal success and all the other highlights of the Tokyo Games, where can you actually watch it? Instead of the instantly available wall-to-wall coverage viewers might have been expecting, this time the best action has often been stuck behind a paywall. Discovery's £900 million rights deal allows the BBC to show just 2 live events at the same time. But dismayed fans say they often don't include the most anticipated moments, while smaller sports fear they're missing out on valuable coverage. Here's Paul McNamara.
This is the golden time for many sports. Olympics in full swing, their craft on display for once, when viewers go from knowing almost nothing about some sports.
Does it matter which way round I hold it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yet 10 minutes later, are armchair experts.
Very nice. What did you think? It was good? I thought it was
Sadly,
good.
Andy. But at this Olympics, access to many sports has been more limited.
So have you been able to watch much of this in the Olympics?
No, not as much as I'd like to have done. The coverage hasn't been fantastic. Been really great. Would have been nice if we could have watched some of the GB shooters shooting a bit more.
Last Olympics, archery was streamed live. This time round, well, it's at the whim of producers to decide. And in effect, unless Great Britain does really well, it's unlikely that it's going to feature live on the terrestrial schedule. And that's the same for many minority sports.
For years, viewers have been spoiled for choice with the amount of coverage the BBC had rights to, but that's all changed. In 2016, the International Olympics Committee sold the European rights to Discovery for £920 million. Around 3/4 of the IOC's revenues come from broadcast rights. Discovery can show all of the action live. A sub-licensing deal it struck allows the BBC to show only 2 live events at any one time. It means BBC TV coverage will fall from around 3,000 hours at the Rio Olympics to 350 at the Tokyo Games.
The coverage from terrestrial broadcast for this Olympics, I would like to see much better for minority sports in the next cycle.
And how much of a role does the IOC play in that?
Well, the IOC should be all around diversity and engaging with athletes and kids, bringing them up to have a more diverse range of sports to focus on. And I think it is the responsibility of the IOC to ensure that level of diversity exists.
In 2004, Gail Ems won silver for mixed doubles badminton at the Athens Olympics, a journey that started 12 years earlier.
For me, watching the Olympic Games as a little girl, 92 was when badminton was first introduced. That was my pinnacle moment. That was my, moment where I went, I want to be an Olympian. I want to represent Team GB.
Why do you think that minority sports have been squeezed out when it comes to the coverage?
When it comes to the Olympic Games, nowadays, it's all about money. Unfortunately, that's the way it goes. You've got sponsors, you've got big name stars, and these big name stars come from the popular sports, and that's the problem. When you're talking about golf, for instance, tennis, football, there are so many debates about whether these sports should be in the Olympics because, it's not the pinnacle, the gold medal is not the pinnacle of their sport. And as you've got the big names, all the other traditional sports just get pushed down the pecking order.
The IOC has defended its broadcasting deals, saying it redistributes 90% of its revenues to support sport around the world. They ran a competitive tender won by Discovery. What gets covered, some say, is ultimately down to the BBC.
There's no reason why the BBC should be missing these golden moments, even with the limited coverage that they do have. It is actually a matter of editing.
The BBC say they're confident they can still be the home of big sporting moments, but appreciate it's frustrating for some viewers. The problem isn't frustration, but participation, say grassroots sports.
If it's not being shown on the TV, how are you supposed to inspire the kids?
If they don't see it, they can't be it.
The Olympics might celebrate the winning, but they inspire the taking part.
All the highlights here on Channel 4 News, but that's all we have time for this evening. We're back at 7 tomorrow night.
Until then, from all of us here, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.
Good evening.